Welcome back to Football Unspoken. So, Josh, we're going to be talking about points deductions for you today. But before we jump into that, I've got a trivia question. Can you tell me which club in the English pyramid has had the highest number of points deduction, or the largest points deduction, I should say?
This is gonna sound outrageous. For some reason, teams that come to mind, was it Derby County?
It's not a bad shout. It's not, because I think they were quite close to administration, but it's not Derby County. It was actually Luton back in 08-09. They got a 30-point deduction in League Two, which
Can I
is
tell you? Can I tell you something so funny? I super genuinely right now because I just already. I was thinking Luton, and the reason why, and I got my evidence. You said it's the 08-09 season, right? That's the season they had it. Yeah, I had Football Manager 08, and you know this because you know me. I used to play with Bury, which no longer exists. And they were in League Two. And I always used to play with Bury, like start the season. And obviously Luton, I remember Luton having a 30-point deduction. They always used to get promoted anyway, which was very funny. But
I love this. They would get promoted anyway. That's fantastic. But moving on. So obviously we've seen some more points deductions coming in, especially in the most recent years with Everton and with Nottingham Forest. But since those point deductions, we have Nottingham Forest in a title challenge, and we have Everton comfortably running away from relegation after getting David Moyes in. So is there a theory, or is there a thought process where some of these slightly bigger clubs like your Newcastle and Aston Villas just take a points deduction for a season and see what happens?
do you know, there's a phenomenal point I've never thought of. And you make a really good point. I can't think of the only club, funny enough, I can think of is Derby County, who maybe had a points deduction and came out worse. But I think their points deduction was the opposite. They went into administration and got a points deduction.
It was Portsmouth who did that.
Okay. So well, that was in the Premier League, but I think in the Championship, Derby County got a points deduction for administration-based stuff as well. So I can't think of another club who's got a points deduction for overspending and not performed better. And you make a great point, provided you don't get relegated and or miss out on anything great. Maybe Newcastle on the cusp of Champions League, you get the points deduction, take the hit, spend 300, 500 million one-time thing, but now you're an established not Premier League, established Champions League club. And, you know, we spoke on another episode about how much money that's worth, the difference between a Europa and a Champions League berth. So I can't argue. I think might be the strategy to actually do that, intentionally just go spend stupid for one season, take a points hit, and then just carry on now with consistent, you built the base, right?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of reasons why I kind of suggest this. And the one of the main ones for me is I look at Elliot Anderson at Nottingham Forest. I look at Yakuba Minte at Brighton, two players who would have been huge for Newcastle's chance of getting into the Champions League this year. And you sit there and you're like, they're young players. There's a fairly young team. Would the points deduction really have been that much of an impact in terms of their final position? Maybe not, because they could be 10 points better off, you know? So I do think in my book, I do sit there and I think there might be a situation where it's almost a bit of a FU to the Premier League and the PSR rules. However, would you see the Premier League accepting that? Do you think there would be a harsher punishment if it was just so blatant?
No, I mean, I'll come back to what I think the Premier League could kind of do to counter that. The one argument I was going to make around, so let's say the Premier League do nothing, right? And everyone's going, this is the new meta, and everyone's just going 500 and above million, and we'll get if whole leagues go minus 10 points or whatever, which would be a funny dynamic. It's like if the whole top six got minus 10 points, it's the same thing. Everyone got no minus points, which I guess is a silly example, but if that becomes the meta, then what would stop any of these teams from doing that? I guess the one counter argument is we've seen with Brighton this year. They were by far the highest spenders this year in terms of transfers, and they've done worse this year than last year in the tables currently, at anyway. And we've seen plenty of teams do this over the years. Automatically spending money doesn't make you a better team. I think you said on a different episode about how Chelsea, you know, now they've got this plan in 4 years to get Champions League and 6 years to win the league, or maybe 2 years Champions League, 4 years win either way. But they've spent £1 billion and they're saying they're 2 to 4 years off winning anything. So my point being that spending a huge amount of money doesn't automatically guarantee any success. I could look at West Ham this year as well. Now they lost Declan Rice, but they spent a lot of money this year. Again, they've kind of got better under Potter. that generally they've been worse. So I'm not sure. It's quite a high risk play because you don't know what the repercussions are going to be going forward, where at the time we get punished, and the Premier League might start escalating them. So going back now to the question you asked about what the Premier League would do, I don't think they would stand for it. And what you'd probably find is if you're going to do it, you should probably do it right now before the Premier League get too angry. Because once the Premier League go, right, this is, becoming a problem, they can start handing out 20, 30 points deduction like Luton got actually in League Two in '09 for your trivia question. Similar things will start to happen with the overspending. But at the moment, you do raise a great point that someone like Newcastle or Aston Villa should probably do it right now and get a 10 to 15 for one season. I don't even know, because also the FFP is done over 3 years. So if you've overspent across 3 years, should you not have a point deduction for 3 years? If you know what I mean, because for the period that and there's also a debate around, could you do it retrospectively in terms of, the season that I overspent in the last 3 years, I get my 10 points taken off that. But you can't do 3 years, but I know it just becomes a whole thing of like, once the season's done, comes actually now you've lost 10 points, you're not in the Champions League anymore. Here's all the money to the next team. So there's a whole lot in the can of worms, basically.
I do sit there as a Newcastle fan. I'm like, to be honest, I think if we'd held on to Minte and Anderson, we probably would be 10 points better off than we are now, realistic. Because I think about games like Fulham and Brentford, those kind of games where we're in the middle of a tricky period and we couldn't really rotate players. So there's a lot of fatigue. And I sit there and I'm like, you bring on a guy like Minte and you bring on a guy like Anderson who have energy and are exciting players to watch. Those are two games we could have won, and those are immediately 6 points already. You're like, it might be balancing out here a little bit in terms of where our overall position would have been. We probably wouldn't have been too much worse off than where we are now. So it is, in my book, I do sit there and as a Newcastle fan, I said, maybe this is worth it. Just worth the punt to have one season where you get hit by it and see what happens. But I do agree that the big problem, or the big not problem, I'd say, but the big risk you're running is the possibility that the players just end up not being good enough. You end up in a situation like Man United, where they've spent 400 million on players who are consistently now loaned out or on the bench. I guess the question at the end of the day is it worth the risk to potentially give yourself a 10 point to allow yourself to create a greater squad at the end of the day? Because that's what teams like Villa and Newcastle are lacking at the moment. They both have very, very good starting 11s, but their squad depth is just not there. And I think that's what potentially you're looking at running the risk on.
The first thing I would look at is stability at the club. So if you're in Newcastle and maybe Villa, I'm doing it because you got such good stability with that manager, director of football, etc. at that club. Everyone knows what's going on, and you have a good idea of where you need to strengthen. I don't think I'm out there for suggesting maybe replace a Kieran Trippier at Newcastle, maybe one of the right wing position, for example. You kind of know those areas where you need to spend big, and you're willing to do that because you know the increase of the squad performance it'll bring. If you're Chelsea, the amount of players you've brought in already and the disarray, you don't know who your best 22 is, let alone your best 11 at Chelsea. So the idea of spending another 500 million to $1 billion and taking the fine, you don't have no idea where your performance level is currently and where it could be. I think that would be, I wouldn't trust Chelsea to spend that money responsibly and actually bring in players that would improve them. So that's ultimately where I would yes or no it is. Do I believe that whoever's doing the transfers could actually improve the squad by a 10-point or more margin with the transfers? Yes, then do it. If no, then don't do it. So Manchester United, Tottenham, Chelsea, Arsenal, I put on the fence, a hard nose, basically. And then Man City, Newcastle, Villa, maybe Brighton are kind of your yes clubs. That's kind of how I would put it.
My last question to you is, would you add any of the promoted teams into that yes club? Do you think there's realistically, would you add any of them?
Oh, it's such a good question. Sorry, I was cutting you off there. But as soon as you said it, I couldn't contain it. It was such a great question. There's a huge problem with the promoted relegation clubs. I definitely think there's another whole podcast within that around this whole transfer. So, well, I'll give you a tidbit of it and then everyone can tell you they like it. One idea I was thinking about is we've got this problem now where the teams being promoted are instantly getting relegated, and it is becoming a problem to just say, oh, it's a once-off. It's not a once-off anymore. It's becoming a reoccurring theme. It might be a good idea. The Premier League is one of the ways to slow down transfers and discourage teams from doing the transfers while strengthening the rest of the EFL pyramid, is putting we'll use a word that's very popular at the moment, put a big tariff on the Premier League, where it's 0.5% or 1% of all players you buy in the Premier League, that money goes to the EFL and it gets put into the pyramid that it drops down between the Championship, League One, League Two, etc. So how that would help is that by providing more funding to the rest of the football pyramid, you allow those teams to actually get closer to the Premier League, and therefore you close this gap a little bit. And it, like I said, discourages the Premier League. If you're going to spend, not that this has ever happened, but one day if you spend 200 million on a player, but you're just given 2 million to the Championship, League One, and League Two, which discourages them to spend their money, but it brings the gap closer and allows those promotion clubs to get closer. With regards to, do I think they should do a spending spree like that? I wouldn't. I just think the risk outweighs the reward in that case.
Yeah, so firstly on that, I think we're going to have to do a podcast on that because that sounded like a very, very interesting topic that I want to dive into. But in terms of the relegation, I'm on the fence. I think those are the teams that I'm on the fence. I do agree with you. There's like a couple of yes teams, definitely, a couple of no teams, definitely. But I feel like Southampton are probably a no team, for me. But you sit there and you're like, a Leicester? Or maybe if they spent outrageously. And then because they're only going to get the deduction next season, like that's the thing for me. I sit there and I'm like, if they only get the deduction next season and they've solidified themselves as a Premier League team and they're not going to be near the relegation zone next season, might be worth a punt. So I do think it's an interesting one, and I think we both had some interesting points around it. I think we kind of agree that maybe the PSR rules could be broken by a few clubs. But it's been very interesting to hear your thoughts on it. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it. Let us know. Do you think that there are some teams who should just go ahead and break those PSR rules and risk them? Or do you think it's just not worth the risk at all and you've got to abide by the laws, play the real way, as we would say? Let us know your thoughts below. Please leave a like, give us a subscribe. And until next time, this has been Football Unspoken. Cheers for now.